What if the ground beneath your feet isn't solid earth, but a roof over something that has been waiting for you to walk across it? What if the blueprints of your new home included a room that doesn't exist on the outside, a space that expands only when you enter it? What if the whispers you hear in the dead of night aren't the wind through the floorboards, but your own voice calling out to you from the dark? The heavy brass key turned in the lock of the Victorian manor with a sharp, echoing click that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the structure. Julian Vance stepped into the grand foyer of Blackwood Hall, a secluded estate tucked deep into the dense, suffocating forests of western Oregon. At 28, Julian was a brilliant but isolated freelance architectural researcher, a man who preferred the company of dusty historical records to human interaction. He had bought the massive historic property at a suspiciously low price after it sat abandoned on the market for over 40 years. The local real estate agents wouldn't even step onto the porch to show it, leaving the keys in a lockbox at the edge of the property line. As he crossed the threshold, the air inside hit him like a physical wall. It was thick, icy, and carried the heavy scent of old pine, damp dust, and a faint, sweet metallic tang that reminded him uncomfortably of copper. He dropped his heavy duffel bag onto the dark hardwood floor, the sound swallowed instantly by the vast cavernous emptiness of the house. Outside, a sudden unseasonal autumn storm began to batter the coast, rain lashing against the tall, stained glass windows like frantic skeletal fingers trying to claw their way inside. It was exactly 9 p.m. when Julian finished setting up his temporary workspace in the grand parlor. Everything felt entirely normal at first. The comforting routine of his work shielding him from the oppressive atmosphere of the estate. The old floorboards groaned rhythmically under his weight, a standard feature of any house built in the late 1800s, and a massive grand pendulum clock in the hallway ticked with a steady, comforting heartbeat. He opened his laptop to log his initial structural findings, intending to pull up the digital blueprints he had painstakingly downloaded from the county archives the week before. But as he clicked the file, the digital world began to fracture. His laptop screen flickered violently, lines of green static tearing across the display. The battery icon, which had been at full capacity just moments ago, suddenly drained to 1% before his eyes, and the Wi-Fi signal vanished entirely into a blank void. Before he could even curse, a deep, resonant hum vibrated through the walls, and the main power grid failed completely. The entire mansion was instantly plunged into a dense, ink-like darkness that felt heavy enough to suffocate him. Julian sighed, rubbing his tired eyes, and pulled a heavy tactical flashlight from his jacket pocket, clicking it on. The sharp beam of white light sliced through the absolute shadows, illuminating millions of dust motes dancing in the air of the grand hallway. He decided to head down to the basement to check the main circuit breaker, assuming an old fuse had simply blown in the storm. He opened the heavy oak door to the basement and began to descend the narrow wooden stairs. With every step he took downward, the air temperature plummeted drastically, turning his breathing into thick white plumes of frost that hung suspended in the air. He reached the bottom step, expecting to find a standard concrete cellar filled with old boilers and storage trunks. Instead, when he swung his flashlight beam around, his mind buckled at the sheer impossibility of what he saw. He wasn't in a basement. He was standing on a cobblestone street. Julian froze, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped animal, as a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. The powerful beam of his flashlight revealed a sprawling subterranean row of dilapidated 19th century storefronts, an apothecary with shattered glass jars, a blacksmith's forge covered in ash, a general store with rotting wooden crates, all perfectly preserved under a massive vaulted ceiling of raw black mountain rock. Panic rising in his throat, he pulled out his phone to check his GPS, but the screen was a chaotic mess. The digital map showed nothing but an endless, featureless black void, and the locator dot was spinning erratically out of control before the device died completely. There was absolutely no mention of an underground settlement in any modern map or historical record of Oregon he had ever studied. It was a geographic impossibility. A ghost town buried beneath his living room, driven by a toxic mix of intense dread and academic obsession. Julian stepped off the bottom wooden stair and onto the cold cobblestones. The crunch of his boots against the dry, ancient dirt echoed loudly in the cavernous silence. As he walked deeper into the dead town, he noticed a weathered wooden notice board standing near the center of the subterranean square. Nailed to it with a rusted iron spike was a brittle, yellowed newspaper from November 14, 1896. The headline screamed in bold, archaic ink, "The Vanishing of Coal Ridge. 112 souls lost to the earth." According to the crumbling text, an entire silver mining town had vanished overnight without a single trace of violence, struggle, or escape. Every single resident, men, women, and children, had officially been declared missing, swallowed by the mountain. A sudden sharp rustle came from inside the general store to his left. Julian spun around, his flashlight beam trembling so violently that the shadows on the walls seemed to dance. The small brass bell above the shop door chimed, a clear, terrifyingly crisp sound that cut through the dead, heavy silence of the underground world. "Is someone there?" "Look, I'm the new owner of the property. I'm armed," Julian called out, his voice shaking, telling a lie born of pure terror. A figure stepped slowly out of the pitch-black interior of the store and into the dim light of the cobblestone street. It was a man wearing a tattered wool coat and a dusty bowler hat, his face completely obscured by the deep shadow of the brim. But it wasn't just his clothes that caused Julian's blood to run cold. It was the way he moved. The man walked with a strange, jerky, unnatural rigidity. His joints popped and cracked loudly with every single step, echoing like breaking twigs, as if he were a heavy wooden marionette being clumsily pulled forward by invisible, malicious strings from above. "We've been waiting for a surveyor to map the expansion," a voice echoed through the dark. It didn't sound like a single man speaking. It was a horrifying, multi-layered collage of dozens of voices, rough miners, frail women, and crying children, all speaking in a perfect, eerie, monotone unison that vibrated directly inside Julian's skull. Julian stumbled backward, his heel catching on a loose cobblestone as he nearly lost his footing. "Who are you? What is this place? How do I get back up to the house?" The figure stopped walking, standing perfectly still about 20 feet away. Then, with a sickening, wet crunch, the entity tilted its head at an impossible, broken 90-degree angle. As the beam of Julian's flashlight finally hit the entity's face, a choked scream caught in his throat. The man had no eyes, no nose, no features at all. It was just a blank, smooth expanse of pale, bloodless skin stretched tightly over a human skull. But beneath the translucent flesh, something alive was moving. Thick, worm-like tendrils were writhing under the surface, aggressively reshaping the skin from the inside, fighting to force the featureless mass into a recognizable human shape. "You are already home, Julian," the chorus of voices whispered, sounding as if they were standing mere inches from his ears, even though the featureless body remained stationary across the square. The entity's blank face began to violently boil and shift. The skin rippled, bubbling up and molding itself into a terrifyingly familiar image. Within a matter of seconds, the shifting flesh settled, forming the exact facial structure, the exact lines, and the exact graying beard of Julian's own father, a man who had passed away in a hospital bed 5 years ago. The entity smiled, but the jaw unhinged too wide, revealing a row of teeth that were too sharp, too white, and far too numerous to be human. It spoke again, using his father's precise, comforting tone, though the voice was hollowed out, carrying a dark, predatory malice. "Come inside, son. It's so cold out there in the rain. Your mother and I have been waiting for you in the dark." Absolute psychological terror gripped Julian's mind, shattering his rational understanding of reality. This wasn't a haunting. It was an ancient supernatural entity, a predatory force that had swallowed the 112 residents of Coleridge a century ago and was now using their mass of stolen memories in physical forms to hunt its next meal. It was copying the people he loved, mining his own mind to break his will to fight. Suddenly, hundreds of whispering voices began to bleed directly from the walls of the cobblestone buildings and the black rock ceiling above. Join the layout. Expand the house. Stay with us. The deep shadows attached to the storefronts began to peel themselves away from the wood, sliding across the ground like spilled ink, all converging on him. As they entered the light, Julian saw them morphing, taking on the grotesque, half-formed shapes of women in Victorian dresses and children in overalls, all stretching out elongated, pale arms toward him. The passage of time seemed to completely disintegrate. Julian's watch face cracked under the pressure of the room, the digital numbers spinning wildly backward into the past. Minutes felt like agonizing, endless hours as he turned on his heel and fled in absolute terror back toward the wooden basement stairs. Behind him, the entity wearing his father's face dropped onto all fours, its limbs bending backward with sickening cracks as it pursued him with a rapid, spider-like skittering sound across the cobblestones. Julian scrambled up the wooden steps, his hands slipping on the icy handrail as he climbed for his life. He threw his entire body weight against the heavy oak door, leading back into the parlor, slamming it shut and throwing the iron deadbolt, just as a heavy, wet, massive thud collided violently against the other side. The wood groaned and splintered under the immense pressure, the brass handle shaking furiously as a chorus of 100 dead voices screamed his name from the other side of the wood. Without stopping to grab his laptop or his bag, Julian ran through the pitch-black parlor, threw open the front doors of Blackwood Hall, and sprinted out into the torrential, freezing rain. He scrambled into his car, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped the keys twice, and fired up the engine. He slammed on the gas, the tires spinning in the mud as he tore down the winding forested driveway, refusing to look back at the dark windows of the mansion in his rearview mirror. He drove through the storm for hours, pushed by pure adrenaline, until the towering pines of the coast finally gave way to the neon lights of the city. The sun was just beginning to rise over the city skyline, casting a weak gray light over the concrete streets, when Julian finally arrived back at his small second-story urban apartment. He was bruised, covered in mud, and trembling from profound exhaustion. He entered his home and immediately locked the heavy metal door with every chain, deadbolt, and security latch he possessed. He collapsed onto his living room couch, his eyes wide and unblinking as he stared at the ceiling. He forced his mind to rationalize the horror. It had to be a hallucination. The mansion had been sealed for 40 years. It was probably toxic black mold, or a severe carbon monoxide leak from the ancient basement piping that had caused a waking nightmare. Yes, that had to be it. He was back in the city now. He was safe in his own modern apartment, miles away from the forest. An hour passed in absolute agonizing silence. Julian's breathing finally began to slow as the warmth of the apartment calmed his frayed nerves. Then a soft, heavy metallic rattle echoed from the front door. Julian stiffened, every muscle in his body locking into place. He watched in frozen horror as the small brass mail slot on the bottom of his door slowly flipped open from the outside. No footsteps had approached his door in the hallway. A heavy, small object slid through the narrow slot, landing on the hardwood floor with a loud metallic thud that seemed to echo through the entire apartment. A pristine piece of folded white parchment followed it, sliding smoothly across the carpet. His breath catching in his throat, Julian forced his trembling legs to carry him across the room. He looked down. Lying on the floor was an antique brass key, identical in every scratch and notch to the one he had used to unlock Blackwood Hall. With a hand that didn't feel like his own, he picked up the folded piece of parchment and opened it. Written across the paper, in a precise, elegant, and impossibly familiar handwriting, his own handwriting, was a single, terrifying line. The structural expansion is complete. Your apartment is now a room in our basement. Look behind you, Julian.